Module 5, inventory management. All right, inventory management, wonderful chapter, as is waiting lines soon to come up. The thing that makes them wonderful is we get to use a mix of both mathematics and a little bit of, policy analysis. So there's something for both sides of our brain in like 2 units coming up. It's very exciting. I love this stuff. Now, I know we're going to start off, as we do with every module, with definitions. And I know that your initial reaction when you hear the word definitions is to flip over and got to go to sleep, maybe have some snooze time. Not this time, okay? When we start talking about definitions and types of inventory and why we have large inventories, why we have small inventories, that's very important policy stuff. We'll learn mathematics, but the mathematics are a little bit stylized. They're suited for the academic environment, and the real calculations are a little bit more complex. But the mathematics capture the essence of the relationship, though. And from a managerial perspective, because this is inventory management after all, from a managerial perspective, the relationship is what's going to be the most important. Okay, the grunt calculations, often there's specialized software for that, and it's nice to know sort of how it works, but the intricacies are not necessary. However, understanding the relationships, that's solid. And even as the mathematics for these calculations become complex, the relationships stay the same. Okay, so key focus on the relationships and discussing how changes in the relationship affect these key metrics that we will talk about. Okay. All right, in violation of course, every PowerPoint rule known to humans, learning objectives, lots of words. Essentially what we're going to do is we're going to focus in on a couple of types of inventory, mostly cycle inventory and safety inventory. There's this thing called anticipation inventory and pipeline inventory. And anticipation, it just means if we think that demand is going to go up in the future, we sort of adjust for it. It's just, you can capture that concept in the other two definitions anyway. Pipeline inventory just means that we're sort of it's a specialized form of inventory when you're in the process of making things. Okay, so complicating factors. We're going to stick with the basics. The chapter is challenging enough without adding a whole bunch of extra details that sort of take away from the main themes of this unit. Okay. We're going to talk about costs. Of course, we got to talk about costs. We're in business. We got to manage the costs. We got to manage those costs efficiently. And so the 2 big types of costs that we'll talk about are holding costs and ordering/setup costs. Okay. And we'll be able to, for the most part, squeeze any type of cost into one of those 2 categories. We all have 2 inventory systems that we'll talk about. One's called a continuous review, which we call a Q system, and one's a periodic review called a P system. There is a hybrid system that we'll sort of allude to a little bit, but we'll focus in on the 2 main sort of players, the Q system and the P system. We'll talk about this thing called the economic order quantity. The economic order quantity is just, what's the sort of theoretically optimal order size? It's a cost minimizing order size. And then when we think of cost minimizing, it's not that necessarily the units are themselves are cheap, but just that the shipping, the ordering process of the items is as inexpensive as it possibly can be. Okay. Those again, highly stylized calculations. Okay, so not necessarily meant to be used literally, but the relationships that it considers, the relationships that it balances, those are important. Next thing is we'll talk about reorder points and safety stock for the Q system. When do we order? How much safety stock is how much should we have around a little extra for those unforeseen bumps up in demand. And with the P system, we're going to figure out what's the target inventory level, the safety stock, and the order quantity. Those are the key metrics with the periodic system, and we'll flesh out those details coming up. Okay? We'll see how, this is where the fun begins, is we'll start talking about how strategy affects our inventory systems, how perhaps government policy affects our inventory decisions, how economic changes affect our inventory systems, and so on. So we've got a really big scope where we can go. We can really use these concepts in such a wide variety of situations, and to help us to sort of evaluate a little bit what happens in those wide variety of situations. So it's really, really great stuff. Okay, and cycle counting, tips for managing cycle counts. We're not really going to get into that stuff. Okay. So inventory, so I know, starting off with the basics, but just so we know, inventory is just we have some materials we're going to use to satisfy customer demand. That's it. Also, we use that inventory to support the production of our own goods and services. Right? They're, raw materials, some work in progress, that kind of stuff, right? So things that we use to make our product is also our inventory. So we have inventory that we use to meet customer demand. We also have inventory that we use in order to make our product or service. That makes sense, right? You kind of visualize it. You kind of see that happening. The whole idea of inventory management is we need to determine how much of this inventory to keep in stock. Right? We don't want to keep too much. We don't want to keep too little, right? It's like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And what the porridge just to be just right, not too hot, not too cold. I don't even know if anybody knows what Goldilocks and the Three Bears are anymore. I could be just having a big senior moment here. So, warning. Alan's gone senile. Okay. So, and then when we keep that inventory, we don't want it too much, you don't want too little, we want just right. Cost effectiveness is key, right? We don't want to miss out on customers, but then, we don't want to pay too much for customers. We don't want money losing customers, and we want profit enhancing customers. So we get those balancing those key issues, which is really, really fun. We have raw materials and we have work in progress. And I call it progress because I'm old. Work in process. And I alluded to those before. And raw materials are what you would suspect that they are, right? They're the inputs in order in the thing that you're making. So you're making your e-books and the little components that are used on that. Typically some sort of integrated chip in there. Probably a little bit of video management, probably an arithmetic logic unit in there. Typically that stuff will be raw materials you get from another vendor, and in the case of either Amazon or Barnes & Noble or Chapters, that's essentially what they do, and they assemble the final product. But they have a bunch of their, what they call their raw materials. Okay, work in progress, it's just, it's partly built pieces of items that we have as they go from machine to machine or from station to station. They're in various levels of completion, not quite finished, but they're getting there. Right? We're starting to put the raw materials together. We just haven't fully formed the final product yet. Okay, and last but not least, finished goods. Hey, this is the item we actually sell, right? We need to keep some of that on stock because we need to meet customer demand. And customer demand, as we will see later on, can be variable. Right? It goes up and down, sometimes in unexpected ways. Remembering variability is a kind of a key sort of thing that we're always battling. It's variability stuff, right? Makes it very hard to forecast, makes it very hard to plan our project times. So variability also kind of makes it a little tricky to manage our inventory and can make that inventory management process a little more expensive than we'd like. Okay, so I like the picture. I don't know, it's kind of a cute picture. I know it's a dorky as all get up. I got it. guilty as charged. So we have our raw materials, and we're cutting that raw materials, and we're making little bolts, and we're making nuts, and we're packaging it in. And the marketing guy said, "Hey, purplish pink packaging, bolt, because hey, we don't want to make it to be a commodity. We want this to be a sort of a boutique item, appealing to the hipsters here. Bolt does it. Just plain old Bolt." That doesn't get the hipsters overpaying for these items. Okay, so we're getting the big bucks from the hipsters because we branded it Bolt, and we take those finished goods and they go on to the next sort of parts of the supply chain. Okay, now into the main event. So we know what inventory is. We know the types of inventory in a very general sense. We know what inventory management is in a very, very general sense. Now let's talk nuts and bolts. Let's start talking policy here. Let's start talking business strategy. Now we have certain reasons why we want to keep that inventory as small as possible. And the biggest inventory is that stinking stuff costs us money. Right? There's an inventory holding cost. There's that old cost to capital that you learn and to love and fear. Delete. To learn, love, and embrace in Finance 301. Because we could have used this money that we've got tied up in inventory for something else. Right? Could have bought our stock. Could have bought somebody else's stock. Right? Could have... You could put it in bonds and made no money. Could have done lots of things with this. But, nevertheless, there is a certain cost to tying up your capital in inventory. So we got to consider that. Right? That's very important. There's also the cost of actually keeping the items, keeping the physical items. Not just the cost of the money it takes to buy that inventory and pay for that inventory that you could have used it, you would have had an opportunity cost, you could have used that money for something else. But there's the physical cost of keeping those items. There's storage costs. Warehouse is not cheap. And with the online world booming, right? Warehouse space is actually somewhat tight. So that's getting to be a bigger and a more expensive resource. So we got to consider that. Handling, people have to keep track of the inventory. Accountants got to count it. Because that accountants count, it's what they do. You've got people have to put it away. You have taxes on sometimes you have taxes on the inventory. It really all depends on the scenario. Certain states in the United States will have a tax on inventory. Okay, so that's a consideration. It is an international world, right? And Alberta does not have a tax on inventory, but that does not mean that everybody does not have a tax on inventory. So we have to consider taxes. Insurance, big one time, right? Insurance can be very expensive. And shrinkage. People steal your stuff. And it's a sad reality of life, son of a guns anyway. But people steal your stuff. Or if you don't want to kind of flip the sinister side of it, your goods, the shrinkage, they become worth less than they would. New models come out, old models aren't worth as much. And so there could be shrinkage in the sense that they lose value in other ways too that maybe aren't so sinister as stealing, but stealing's a big one. Okay, so that cost of capital, so those are serious big considerations. So we kind of know that changes to those will impact whether we want small inventories or not. So in the cost of capital, essentially interest rates and return on equity and so on, right? We think of our cost of capital, and you have a formula for that weighted average cost of capital. I'm not going to force you to calculate it here in that class. You get a lot of opportunity to do that in Finance 301. However, the thing we have to keep track of, right? Cost of the equity, whether we're paying dividends or whatnot, interest rate on the debt, and it's a weighted average, WACC, WACC. But if that goes up, cost of holding inventory goes up as well. We're not going to want to hold as much inventory. So if there's an increase in interest rates, our desire to hold inventory will go down because it's more expensive for us to hold that inventory. And if the cost of interest goes down, okay, well, it's less expensive to borrow money to buy inventory. We may be more likely to have more inventory. And that's the way we want to be thinking through this stuff, right? If the cost of inventory goes up, storage goes up, well, we don't want to store as much stuff. So the pressure for small inventories grows. We want to have that inventory smaller. But if we're in a locale or area, or if there's incentives and warehouse space is very, very cheap or goes down, then maybe we do entertain holding a little bit more inventory. Okay, so these are all key managerial concepts that sort of drive whether we look at something. And same thing with shrinkage. More people are stealing stuff. But it doesn't, again, like I said, it doesn't have to be sinister. It could be obsolescence. If we're in an industry where products become obsolete really quickly, looking at you, cell phones, we don't want to keep too much on inventory because we run the risk that all of a sudden the new model comes out. Nobody wants that old model because the new model has 27 different cameras on it, and the old model only has 24 different cameras. And who could ever live with a phone without 782 cameras on it? And there we go, right? That particular item is depreciated, and now you have to liquidate it to get it out. It's the same thing with fashion and clothes. New fashions come out. That means we're less likely to want or desire the old fashions, and they become worth less money. Okay. Inventory taxes, again, is a big deal. Sometimes some states have been changing the inventory taxes. There's a nice link there. This is mostly applied to the states, but we got to remember we are in a global supply chain, and we can't just keep Alberta or Canada focused. We have to think of, could potentially have operations in the various United States in the United States and indeed worldwide, and we want to consider inventory taxes. Nice little link for that, but some states have been bringing in an inventory tax, although not too many. The more likely event recently has been states getting rid of that inventory tax because they recognize that, especially with an online environment where companies are warehousing or trying to warehouse their goods across the United States and even across Canada so that they can do order fulfillment much more quickly. And that states are seeing that, hey, having this inventory tax is a big impediment to large online retailers locating a warehouse in their particular state, right? And there's a lot of employment that goes with that, and there's a lot of tax revenues that go with that, and so on. And I think they're finding that the added benefits and the added tax revenues from getting rid of the inventory tax outweigh the revenues they were actually getting from the inventory tax. Okay, so lots of stuff moving on, and all we've just talked about is just the basic metrics in why we want to have small inventories, right? But there's a lot of policy implications that are coming through on that, and those are the kind of questions I like, because those are really business strategy and managerial questions that need to be asked. The grunt calculations are, they're fine. They're good. It's always fun to do some calculations, but there's more to this than that. Much, much more. I think so. We also have pressures for large inventories. Customer service being the biggest one, right? We want to make sure that we can meet those orders quickly. We want to make sure we can meet the doggone orders in the first place. Right? No, nothing ticks anybody off more, me included, than you go to order something and it's not in stock. And you try again, and it's still not in stock. Drives you crazy, right? Makes you an unsatisfied customer. In fact, it might make you a non-customer because it's so bad. So we have customer service as a key component, but we can't meet this at any cost, right? We have to balance it. We're going to try to meet, customer demand a certain proportion of the time. We understand that if there's really a real big run on toilet paper, that you may not be able to meet customer demand all the time. So we have to balance that. Right? Management Science 352, all about trade-offs and variability. And we're trying to deal with both as best as we can. But again, we want to meet the customer service, and we'd have more inventory on hand to do so. Maybe customer service is not a priority in our part of our business strategy. We're selling it cheap. You want it cheap, you wait. You want to pay more? Okay, that other guy over there has got more inventory, he's got higher costs, you're paying 20% more, you want to do that? Fine. You want to wait a little while we replenish your inventory? You're going to get it a lot cheaper from us, right? It just all depends on what business they're in, and we're minding the business that we're in. Ordering costs, another big one for large inventories. When you have small inventories, it means you're always ordering a lot. You're always ordering, right? You're selling a little bit, you're ordering a little bit. You're selling a little bit, you're ordering a little bit. Whereas if you have large inventories, you're ordering less frequently. Now, it costs money to put together an order. Right? You got to, perhaps depending on the inventory review system that you use, you have to go and check to see how much you have in stock. Some larger companies have automated this, and so the computer technology looks after that. So the costs from a lot of orders has come down, but there's also costs of shipping too. Right? I mean, you look at, for instance, a Walmart or someone like that. They're going to order. You got to fill the truck, right? They got a semi-trailer truck. Sending a semi-trailer truck your way with whatever goods that you require. But they don't like to use less than full truckloads. Okay? They want a full truckload because they don't want a half truck going there and an empty truck coming back and a half truck going there, right? They're trying to manage their transportation costs that way. And so they want a full truck, which means you're going to have perhaps a little bit more inventory on hand in the store because you need to fill the truck up when you do purchase stuff or when you do order stuff. Another thing that becomes important, and I think this becomes even more important in the 2020-2021, which is when I'm recording this, the 2021 era, is time. The time part. And the procurement process is a lot trickier now during the pandemic, and I'm sure continuing on into the post-pandemic. It's just the negotiating for the supplies, and national boundaries have become a little bit thicker, let's put it that way, harder to navigate, a little bit more nationalism in the procurement process, especially for items that are considered essential. And so negotiating those terms, doing the paperwork, doing the follow-up, that's now become a pretty it was never trivial, but it's become even more challenging. Okay, so that's become a lot trickier. Also, the length of time to get the order is totally upside down. Okay. I remember ordering stuff February 2020. You can pretty much say if it's coming out of the United States, hitting the Canada, it's a week. You get it in a week. If you're able to get on it on a pallet, you get it 3-4 days. And that was pretty solid, low variability. Pandemic, end of mid-March 2020 onwards to this date of chit-chat here, which is March 1st, 2021. Yeah, it's you get it when you get it. You don't get it faster. It's on the other side. It's just a matter of how much longer it takes because the system is somewhat overwhelmed. Okay, so it becomes really, really tricky, and especially in the current era, very tricky. So you may want to do that less frequently because it's a real pain in the butt. Setup costs. So you have a machine, and we sort of alluded to this a little bit in the constraint management section. You have a machine, and you want to keep that bottleneck resource pumping and producing. You never want it idle, and so you minimize how many setups and changes that you do in your products. And that, in that case, you want large inventories because you want to do larger production runs. And that makes sense, right? And so again, also with that pressure for large inventory is the equipment utilization and the labor utilization, right? Just kind of hearkening back to our constraint management days when we want to keep that bottleneck working all the time, as close to 100% as we possibly can. Okay? And sometimes in order to do that, to do larger production runs, again, like I said, we need to have more inventory available to keep feeding that process. Okay, so last slide in this particular part, I guess, in the first part of inventory management, transportation costs. I was explaining with the Walmart case. Walmart, they do not like to ship partial truckloads to their stores, so you have to fill the truck, or for the most part, it's strongly preferred that you fill the truck, and in that case, you get bigger orders, larger inventories as a result, but cheaper shipping. And now with the shipping end of it has become a lot more, has become harder to manage, with pandemic and the post-pandemic world, that that's a huge pressure to have a large amount of your own inventory on stock, because you're controlling it, and depending on others for important goods, it's become a lot riskier to do it that way. A little bit of accounting involved in the payments to suppliers. Clearly less payments, less checks, less mistakes, less invoices to track, and there's the whole overhead cost that's associated with that. Also, and this is not, even though it's our last bullet of this particular part, it's not an insignificant bullet, is quantity discounts. Right? There can be some pretty decent discounts that we can take advantage of if we do order in large amounts. Okay, so that kind of wraps up our beginning part of inventory management, and then we'll move on into some inventory reduction tactics and the EOQ, the economic order quantity, coming up next.